Good morning, everyone. We are so glad that you're here with us today. We want to say thank you and welcome to today's program on how to improve access to and news coverage of the upcoming midterm election for voters with disabilities. And thank you so much for making the time to be here with us this morning for this important topic. I'm Beth Francesco with the National Press Club Journalism Institute. We're so glad to bring together this panel of experts in accessibility, elections, and journalism for this important conversation. We have a live transcription, closed captioning option available during this program. If you're joining us on a desktop or laptop computer, you can enable this at any time by finding the live transcription button in the navigation menu. Click show subtitle and the closed captioning will begin. You can also disable this at any point by clicking hide subtitle. We're also going to put instructions in the chat for closed captioning if you're joining us on a mobile device. We will be recording the program and a link to the video will be emailed to you. So if you miss anything, don't worry, you're going to have a chance to catch it a second time. Highlights from the program will also appear on our website and in our newsletter with the video. If you're not already receiving our daily newsletter for journalists, you can subscribe. We're going to put the link in the chat. This program is designed as a conversation, and we hope that you're going to join in with comments and questions. Please share questions anytime in the Q&A queue or the chat. We'll be monitoring them and responding during and later in the program. It's now my honor to introduce this program's moderator, Wendy Liu, who is a senior staff editor on the flexible editing desk at the New York Times. Wendy's also a global speaker on disability representation in the media. We couldn't be in better hands. Wendy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Wendy Liu. My pronouns are she, her. And before we get things started, I'll just briefly share a little bit more about my background. As Beth said, I'm an editor at the New York Times. And before that, I was an editor and reporter at HuffPost, where I covered the intersection of disability, politics, and culture. And I've worked with a variety of newsrooms for the last few years to help improve their disability coverage, everything from using accurate, respectful language to finding story ideas and sources. And so for today, we're going to be talking about how to improve your election coverage for people with disabilities as we're heading into the midterms. More than 61 million Americans live with disabilities, but they remain underrepresented and undercovered in journalism produced by US newsrooms. And so as a decisive midterm election approaches, recent coverage shows state and local measures intending to reduce voting by absentee ballot, limiting access at polling locations, and also limiting information that explains how people with disabilities can cast their ballots. So midterm elections are November 8th, and we want to help you have a good foundation of accessibility issues in the election cycle so that you can be better informed in your coverage leading up to election day and beyond. So we are so lucky to have these amazing panelists here with us today. We've got Thomas Hicks, the chairman of the United States Election Assistance Commission. We have Jessica Huseman, the editorial director for VoteBeat, and Hannah Wise, the Central Region Audience Development editor for McClatchy. And Hannah is also the creator of Disability Matters, which is a toolkit to help newsrooms better serve the disability community. So I'm going to invite each of our panelists just to share a little bit more about their roles and their work. Thomas, would you like to start first?
Yes, thank you, Wendy. I really do appreciate being here today. I'm, as you said, Tom Hicks, chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And to help folks with disabilities is basically our founding goal. Our enacting legislation, which will be 20 years old on October 29th, basically says that those who have disabilities should still be able to vote independently and privately. And so that's the basic understanding of our agency. more than 35 million people have disabilities in the country, roughly a sixth of the total electorate. And a very wise man once told me that if you live long enough, you will have some form of disability. So it's not a matter of us versus them. It's we need to be all inclusive to ensure that every American who is eligible to vote can do so privately, independently, and have their votes counted accurately. So I'll stop there and answer any questions that you may have and talk a little bit more about our agency as we move on.
Jessica, you want to share a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, thank you. I am the editorial director of VoteBeat. We're a national nonprofit newsroom that is covering election administration and voting access. Right now, we have reporters in Arizona, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, which, light stuff happening election-wise there. So I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting stuff to say. And we think a lot about the ways that we can better serve the voting population, because then we consider that our audience, and a huge part of that is voters with disabilities, who are often overlooked in conversations around everything from the setup of polling places to cybersecurity options. And so, I'm excited to be here and excited to have this conversation.
And I'm Hannah Wise. I'm the Central Region Audience Development Editor for McClatchy. Very long title, but I work with the Kansas City Star, the Wichita Eagle, and the Fort Worth Star Telegram to lead digital strategy. My team works on the homepage, social media, newsletters, live events, and engagement reporting. I also last year completed a fellowship through the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri, where I did research in order to build Disability Matters, the toolkit that Wendy mentioned earlier. I believe the link is in the chat, but it is a toolkit designed for journalists to learn about disability history, to learn about accessibility measures, and also ideas about what you can be covering to bring disability into every aspect of your work.
Amazing, thank you all. So yeah, just to kind of get conversation started, I thought it'd be great for us to talk more about, what are some of the biggest access issues that people with disabilities face at the ballot box? And anybody feel free to chime in, but maybe we can, again, start with Thomas. I know you work on the Election Assistance Commission, so focusing on exactly this, voter access. So, what are some efforts that what are some of the efforts that have been made to make voting more accessible? I know you've done some research recently looking at challenges and progress made by elected officials to serve disabled voters. So yeah, could you talk a little bit more about that?
So thank you, Wendy. That's a great question. In 2012, the EAC did a report on disability access, and then we did 2 additional reports with Rutgers University in 2021 and 2020, and then one that recently came out on the digital divide. The findings from the digital divide were shocking to me in terms of the fact that, well, not as shocking, but it was the fact that those who have disabilities are less likely to use computers or have access to things. So when we talk about voting at home and so forth and printing out your ballots, a number of people who have disabilities don't have printers at home. So how can we go around ensuring that they can still have their right to vote if they are not able to make it to a polling place or have a printer at home? So other access things that we've done, we've published over 25,000 small guides to give to folks who have disabilities so that they know their rights when they go to a polling place. One of them being that they are able to have anyone they choose to help them cast the ballot should they choose, or being able to have an accessible polling place. And so those cards are available on our website at eac.gov. We also did that in Braille for folks who are not able to see, and we did it in large print as well. The digital divide report, I think, is really helpful, and it was really not a huge fight for the 4 commissioners to actually authorize that. And I think of it as this is a nonpartisan issue to ensure that those who have the right to vote are able to cast their votes and cast their votes privately and independently, which I said earlier is part of our founding legislation, The other piece that we do is we serve as a clearinghouse. So we gather enough information, we gather a ton of information to disseminate to the states. So we hope that, through our clearinghouse function, election officials can read these reports and make adjustments so that they can ensure that folks have access to the polls as well.
I think it's so important what you said about making sure that people with disabilities know their rights. I feel like so often people will go to polling places or try to find information, and they don't realize the resources that are out there that they can use. So it's like they don't know what they don't know. So I feel like providing that information.
Oh, hopefully this will show up, but I carry one in my own wallet. So voting rights, and then it folds up to show what your rights are. And I know that it's going to be difficult to see, but it's something that even I carry in my wallet to show what those rights are.
Absolutely. Anna or Jessica, feel free to chime in, share, what do you feel like are some of the things that are barriers to access in voting, what you've seen as an editor, as a reporter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to chime in. I think that I'm from Kansas originally, and now I've worked in Texas and in Missouri, and all 3 states I would not say are the most accessible places for anyone to vote, let alone people with disabilities. And so I think, to echo Chairman Hicks, yes, helping people know what their rights are, knowing that card exists. I'm thrilled. I'm going to print one out today. And just being able to talk about it, partner with other organizations in your community. I've done a lot of partnering with our local libraries because they're also very interested in making sure that information about voting and being a citizen is very accessible. So I think that the journalist's role is to share that truth with as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I think that the disabled community sort of gets defined in really odd ways. And I think that people, when they think about voters with disabilities, they think about physical disabilities, right? They see the blue sign with the wheelchair, and that's a disability. But there's a wide range of other things that can affect their ability to cast a vote, right? Lack of use of hands is one of them, right? The EAC, Chairman Hicks can talk more about this, but it requires that machines be able to be used without the use of your hands. And that sounds crazy, but it is really important for a really large portion of the disabled community. And then also having accessible plugins for making, reading to you and making the text, less just on a screen. These accessible devices are really important. And as technology improves and as voter confidence improves, then I think we'll see that counties can rise to this occasion. Voting machines are now more accessible than they've ever been. And I think that that's a really big step forward for this community, because it's not just, oh, we have that weird machine over there in the corner that I guess you can use, right? The federal law requires that there be a voting machine accessible to all people with disabilities in every voting location. What that often means is that poll workers are given an old voting machine that they've not been trained to use, and then someone comes in who needs to use it and they don't know how to help them. And so counties are making that better. They're making voting machines accessible all the way through, not just one in the corner. And so these are all huge improvements for this community. And I'm hoping that local media will cover that more proactively.
Jessica brings up a really great point in that with the Help America Vote Act, every voting location should have at least one piece of voting equipment that's accessible to any individual who needs it or wants it. All too often, that machine has been put in the corner, not turned on, and people have not been trained on it. It is my hope when we pass the voluntary voting system guidelines 2.0 last year that companies will start building towards newer machines, more secure machines, more accurate machines, and more machines that everyone can use, so that we don't have a this versus them attitude, that we have one piece of voting equipment in a location. And we've made such strides since the original VBSG came out, the 1.0, which basically came out in 2005 or 2007. I'm not sure of the exact date anymore, but the fact being that when those came out, it was before the iPhone. And so if you think about the strides that we've made since smartphones have come along, and the way that machines are looked at today in terms of being more interactive and more user-friendly, then we should be having voting machines that are out there that allow for people to cast their votes without any sort of need, so that if I'm need to have a plug-in for sip and puff, so because I don't have arms, then I should be able to use that. And so that we have one piece of voting equipment per polling place, as opposed to two or more.
Absolutely. And Jessica, I'm also so glad that you pointed out that disability encompasses a variety of things. You know, it could be physical, visible or invisible, you know, developmental. And so I totally agree that we have to sort of recognize that such a wide, diverse population. And also, as Chairman Hicks mentioned, that people can acquire a disability at any point in time in their lives as well. So, yeah. So looking into the midterm elections and what matters to voters with disabilities, let's talk about what are some of the biggest issues in the elections that people with disabilities are particularly concerned about. And this is for, anybody, feel free to chime in.
You're on mute.
You'd think that after 2.5 years, I would anyway. So I think that one of the things that I think that we should really discuss is the new laws that have come into place in a lot of places. And the things that I'm specifically concerned about as it relates to this community is that there have been a lot of attempts to criminalize helping someone else vote. And restrictions around who can do that and what paperwork you have to fill out in order to do that. In Texas, for example, there's all sorts of forms you have to sign attesting that you didn't, help them pick their candidate. You just help them vote, right? And these don't prevent people from having someone of their choice with them at the polls. But what it does is creates an environment in which poll workers feel uncomfortable with that and feel like they're going to get in trouble if they allow someone to go into the voting booth with another person, right? And for this community, especially when not all disabilities are visible, your ability to say, oh, I need them to come into the polls with me without judgment and without fear of criminalization is really important. And so I think, I'm hopeful that we can write specific explainers that sort of make sure that people understand their rights in these specific situations. But I've been talking to a lot of county clerks who are sort of proactively helping poll workers become more comfortable given the new restrictions. So, I know that the midterm is coming and we don't have a ton of time left to train poll workers to do this stuff really well. And so I think that that's really what's concerning to me.
One thing that I would like to just emphasize again is, or initially, I guess, is back in 2020 when we had to basically redefine the way that elections were run. Election officials did a great job of being contingency planners, of basically saying, we're going to basically have to run 2 elections. one vote by mail and then one for in person. And how can we ensure that both of those are run well and both of those are run where people can accurately have their votes counted? And I think that with that, we saw a great deal of access given to other individuals who may not have had that access before because of other issues that were going on. But I would like to point out that it is law that you can have whoever you want to assist you for a federal election to cast your vote. There's two exceptions, one being it can't be your boss, and the other being that it can't be a union rep. But other than that, you can have anyone you want. So, and I would hope that that's some story that we can all read before the election as well.
That's a great point. I'd also, the thing that I'm thinking a lot about, especially after this week of news, is the role of journalists in creating an environment that people can request a reasonable accommodation if they're a candidate. I'm speaking specifically about John Fetterman in Pennsylvania and the closed captioning that he requested as an accommodation in that interview. To me, 50% of journalists' role in running an election is presenting information about the candidates. And that means making sure that information is accessible, making sure that the candidate doesn't have an unnecessary barrier to participating in that interview. And it's not the role of journalists to decide what is and is not a reasonable accommodation in that way. I regularly encourage journalists to review the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as flawed as it is in some ways. It does give some helpful guidelines. And the more, like, that has just made me very scared, I think, for as we go into 2023 as a disabled person. Like, what does the tenor of this environment mean? I would also say that I'd love to see more reporting around Medicaid and Medicare expansion. What does that mean for people? Anything having to do with helping people live smarter, healthier, and more equitable lives, and not framing disability as harmful or a bad thing. I firmly believe that I like the person I am with my disability, and I wouldn't give it away. I wouldn't wish it upon someone. It makes my life a little bit more difficult at points, but I see it now as a superpower, that I've become more empathetic and I'm a better listener, and I'm just thrilled about those skills. So I'd hope that journalists can rise to the occasion to do better than we have for our entire history, frankly.
I feel like all of you brought up so many great points, and I feel like I couldn't have said it any better. Jessica, you went into this earlier, but I know you recently wrote about a bunch for hand-counted ballots and how it sort of overlooks the needs of disabled voters, as well as other efforts to sort of curb voter fraud, but can actually lead to people being left out of the vote. So I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. And I'm sorry, my dog's doing things. Go on, Walter. So this is a hill I've been slowly dying on for years, I'm pretty sure. But there's a movement, and it's a movement that I understand and sympathize with. I think that the motivations behind it are wonderful, right? This hand cast paper ballots. Let's just stop there, even if we don't hand count them, right? Like writing your choice on a piece of paper and submitting it so that it's counted, right? Like, this is not an accessible option for lots of people and for lots of different reasons. And so what people say is, okay, well, fine, it's not accessible for everyone. Let's have everybody who can cast a hand-marked paper ballot, and everybody else can cast a vote on a voting machine if they need to, right? Like, the otherization that's happening there is really unproductive. And it also makes it such that the ballots can't be appropriately anonymized, right? If everyone is casting one type of ballot and then we shuttle the disabled community over to an old crusty voting machine and make them cast a ballot that looks very different, their ballot is no longer anonymous, right? Like you can pick out their ballot from a crowd, and this sort of defeats the purpose of the anonymous ballot that we have a long tradition of in the United States. And so I think that when people advocate for things like this because they think that it is more secure, and in some ways, I suppose it is, it just leaves a lot of people out. And the other thing that I would say is that I think people have this idea that hand-marked paper ballots are really easy to read and the best way to understand voter intent. No, I have seen so many weird ballots. Like if you give somebody a piece of paper and a pen, they're going to do weird things with it. They're going to check it. They're going to X it instead of filling in the bubble. They're going to write their thoughts about all the candidates around the corner, right? They're going to erase one dot and put the other one in. And then what happens is that there's like a group of humans that have to figure out what your intent was, right? Like this is not the most accessible and easiest way to cast a ballot. And it especially impacts the disabled community. And I think that otherization has sort of become ingrained into this advocacy around hand-marked paper ballots. And I wish that they would reconsider.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down, because I think it can be so complicated to sort of understand these issues, and so important for journalists to know how to cover this. And it's such a big part of our job, like Anna mentioned earlier. So,
well, I would also point out that Florida 2000 was about voter intent, and the way that people were filling out those ballots were it was what Jessica was saying. But how do we move? That was 20 plus years ago. How do we move towards newer technology to allow for this to happen? And so I would advocate for folks who are constantly advocating for hand-marked paper ballots to advocate for the additional funding that's going to be needed, because states don't have the funding that they need to replace voting equipment. You know, we at the EAC have given out over $800 million in the last 3 years, but that was mostly for pandemic relief and security issues as well. And I'm not lobbying, so I don't want anyone screaming about me lobbying here. It's more of, if we're going to advocate for additional things to be done where we can move towards newer technology, then we should be advocating for those resources as well.
just Jessica, did you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I see Susan's comment in the chat that I'm ill-informed, and hi, Susan, it's nice to see you again. I would just like to say that what Thomas Hicks just said is entirely accurate. It's true. There are very expensive new voting machines that will produce ballots that look exactly like a hand-marked paper ballot. Counties can't afford them. And so to the extent that we are both demanding that they use hand-marked paper ballots and not giving counties additional funding so that they can buy these fancy machines that Susan likes, we can't have them, right? So we have to live in reality, and we have to make the best choices that we can with the resources that are available to us. And this is not a resource that it's available to us, right? And so to the extent that we're demanding that counties who can't afford machines that produce identical hand-marked paper ballots use hand-marked paper ballots, we are otherizing the disabled community, and that is simply a fact.
Thank you. And so kind of in terms of like getting news out, sort of shifting gears to how reporters should be making sure their actual coverage is accessible. I wanted to turn it to Anna. I know you created Disability Matters toolkit as a fellow with the Reynolds Journalism Institute. It's something that I've found to be so useful. I've got it bookmarked. So can you tell our audience more about this toolkit and how journalists can use it this fall as they cover the midterms and beyond? There's so much in there.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Yeah, Disability Matters is a toolkit. I'm framing it as open source. So it is built in a Google Doc by design so that people can add comments as they have questions about something, or maybe they have an insight to add, that I'm continually updating it. I think we're at like a 1.5 or 2.0 version. I answered some questions recently. I would say the number one question I get from reporters is, what can I do as an individual reporter to make my work more accessible? And the easiest thing that I say to them is to use alt text, alternative text, image descriptions on your social posts. Pretty much every platform now has some way of adding image descriptions. Twitter has started to really prompt you to actually add the description. And so like viewing that not as an extra thing to do, but as a way to make your journalism the most complete. It's part of telling the story. So I'd say like use alt text. Also push for this to be a technical priority within your organization. Obviously, if you are the New York Times or the Washington Post, you have a lot more resources than the 4-person NPR newsroom in a rural community. So I think the expectations are a little different, but I see time and time again that product teams or newsroom leaders are saying, oh, that's a nice to have, like we'll get it in the next quarter, we'll add it to the technical roadmap. And then it never gets added, but it takes lots of people saying like, this is a priority for me. Our job is to get as much information to as many people as possible. And by not doing the bare minimum in terms of web accessibility, you're leaving readers, listeners, audience on the table. I'd also say that doing a little bit of your own homework. That's why I included a section about disability history, so that you're not going into an interview and expecting your source to sort of explain their lived experience to you. So understanding what has happened in the past, what have advocates been working toward for years, and also what is a realistic future for whether technology or from a financial standpoint. I think some of the conversation about the voting machines is true. Like it can just get really expensive and unaffordable for a lot of people. And I'd also say just ask people in your community. I think the second most frequently asked question that I've received is whether to use person first or identity first language. Person first meaning person with a disability, identity first meaning disabled person. I feel really comfortable saying disabled person because that is who I am. But there are other people who don't feel comfortable with that, or their preference is to use person first. So I would encourage anyone to have a style book that is flexible and encourages people to provide feedback. When I worked at the New York Times previously, and I worked on our ADA 30 package, and one of the major questions that we grappled with was whether to capitalize the D on deaf or B on blind. And ultimately, those of us working on the project had to lobby within the Times to say, like, this is an important distinction. These are people in this community. We need to show them the respect with the language that we are choosing to publish. And it ended up quite well. So I don't assume things, do the best that you can to make things accessible from a digital perspective, and then just ask and actively listen to the disabled community that you're serving.
Thank you so much for that. And I totally agree with you that providing accessibility, it's not just extra things to do, but that they are priorities to make sure we're not leaving out readers and viewers, and that it is the bare minimum. Something I often see newsrooms doing is only making coverage about disability issues accessible. And so, but like people with disabilities care about so much. Like we don't just want to talk about disability. Of course, it's essential for us, but you know, it's not like we're not just consuming news about disability, and we should be making coverage accessible across the board. Anything else to add from Chairman Hicks or Jessica?
There's a couple of things that I really wanted to add. One being for folks who it's probably too late now, but for 24 and 26 moving forward, I would encourage everyone to at least serve as a poll worker once in their lives, to see what it's like to be on the inside of a polling place for 12 hours, to go through the setup of machines, the voters coming in, the breakdown of machines, and reporting those votes at the end of the day. That's a wonderful experience that I think everyone should have. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. I don't mean just those folks who are able to do this. I mean folks who have disabilities to sign up as well, folks who have served in our military, folks who are retired, everyone. I think that would be absolutely wonderful. And particularly those of you who write stories about this, serve as a poll worker, because I know there's a number of journalists on here as well. So you might say, well, hey, I can't do that for a general election because I'm covering the general election. Well, guess what? Primaries are coming up as well. So serve
and city elections and county elections and school board elections. Yes.
Exactly. There's a number of opportunities to serve as poll workers, and we always fall short on the number of poll workers that we have. The second is there's a conference that I go to every year that I absolutely love because it gives me an understanding of some of the difficulties that are still out there. And it's the African American Disability Conference, which is held every February in Phoenix, Arizona. It's going to be held twice this year, or next year. It's going to be virtual in February, and then it's going to be in person in June. And I think of it as, it's not only talking about the facts of people who have disabilities and the problems that they have in voting, but also other aspects as well. And that would be, finding jobs, the digital divide, and other aspects. And how do you get information? If you have a disability, do you get that from TV? Do you get it from radio? Do you get it from print? And I think that those sorts of conferences are wonderful to educate not only those who have disabilities, but everyone overall. But the last point that I want to make is that we all benefit when we bring everyone up. In terms of, I will never forget, his name was Spooner in Boston, and it was one of the first hearings that we held when we first got to the EAC. It was up in Boston, and he told a wonderful story about how curb cuts came around. They were not for people who don't have disabilities. They were for people in wheelchairs or for other folks as well. And so those curb cuts allow for those folks who have disabilities to get from one side of the street to the other and continue on with their lives. And it was just really great in that he told that story, but he said that everyone benefits from that. So now that when I bring my luggage anywhere, I don't have to lift it up. I can just roll up on a curb cut and move forward with that. So I think that of it as we move towards newer technology to allow for folks who have disabilities to vote independently and privately, like everyone else, that it's not only benefiting them, it's benefiting us all. So.
I have one last question for everyone here before we head into Q&A. So, what are some story ideas that journalists can work on right now in their newsroom? And, what are some other practical steps that they can take as they cover the midterms? What questions should they ask officials? Yeah.
I think that you should take a good look at the Department of Justice's website, because they do a lot of investigations on polling locations that are not ADA compliant. And certainly there are far more jurisdictions that are not ADA compliant than the DOJ has time to investigate. But, I think that's something that I think that they think journalists should pay attention to, which is where the polls are. And it's not necessarily geographically, like we've all thought about that, like which neighborhoods are the polls moving in. I'm not going to talk more about that, but the actual buildings that are being used for polling locations are often very inaccessible. And I sympathize with counties, right? Like they have to stand up an entire election in like churches and schools and businesses and closed stores and strip malls. Like overnight, they like all of a sudden have 18,000 offices, right? It's hard to find places that are particularly accessible. And so what becomes most useful is having things like vote centers so that people can pick where they go as opposed to precincting voting, having mail voting options be accessible to people in like really profound ways so that they can use their own accessibility technology at home to fill out their ballot and send it back, right? There are lots of ways that we can creatively serve this community as long as we're attuned to what their real needs are. And I think that if we take the time to consider sort of the state of the polling place, we'll come up with some interesting things to cover.
I would encourage you to just ask. I'm a big practitioner of engagement journalism. And so bringing the public along in our reporting process. We don't know what we don't know, and we don't know everything that people want to know out of our community. And so we pretty regularly say, like, we are getting ready to work on coverage of the election, or we're working on at X, Y, or Z. And we just ask people to say, tell us what you want to know. What questions do you have? What has worked in the past and what hasn't worked? I think drawing a little bit from solutions journalism, and it's also really helpful in this way, that you should highlight what has worked in a similarly sized local community that you could offer as a solution to your county. What has really been functional or not functional, and highlight the good and really shine a light on the bad.
Awesome. Oh, good. Okay. So we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. And I know there's been such lively discussion in the chat. And we want to hear from you. So I think it'd be a great time to start taking some questions from the audience. I think I've already seen a few flow in over the course of the last hour. Let me see. Kathy asks, would you please address the additional challenges of voting while incarcerated for our disabled voters?
I can honestly say I don't know the additional challenges that they would face other than not having access to the polls as well. I know that there are 2 states that allow for folks to vote for all races, whether or not they're incarcerated or not, Vermont and Maine. I believe those 2 states are, but I'm not sure. And I don't want to, speak on something that I'm not educated on the additional challenges that they may have of being incarcerated and also having a disability as well. So,
I'll just add one quick thing, which is that there's many states prevent you from voting if you're actively in prison for a felony, but if you're in jail awaiting trial and you've not been charged, you still have the right to vote. And jails are supposed to provide that. And so if you are both incarcerated and disabled, it does compound the problem, right? Like in the same way that poll workers are not appropriately trained to serve the disabled community, jail guards are not either, in like very profound and real ways. And so, I think that group of people who are in city jails or county jails or in prison but not charged with a felony that would prevent them from voting do have access to the ballot, and there needs to be better standardization around that. This group of people is just continually ignored as a voting population generally.
Someone asked, how do journalists manage the definition of a person with a disability when there is no alignment across journalism, financial services, government? Mentions that it's a little bit challenging. It's, in the ADA, the definition uses like regarded as, and it can be subjective in figuring out what this means. So I think this is a great question. So
yeah, I can take a pass at this. I think that the ADA does a fairly good job of making it not too specific. My disability is invisible, but it is outlined in the ADA specifically, which I am very grateful for. But I think the ADA also applies to pregnancy, to alcoholism, to mental health struggles. Like it should be broad. We don't want a narrow definition. And I don't think journalists need to be in the business of creating that narrow definition. In one of my pieces I've written before for RJI, I said, like, being able to say that I am disabled gives me ability to ask for accommodations, to look for help and assistance. It also meant that when I got sick, I became part of this larger community that was able to help me. And that's incredible. And so I would never want a reporter or an editor to say, you're not disabled enough. That is maybe my biggest fear. And so I think that if someone says, like, I have a disability, you need to respect that and proceed as so.
They don't have to respect it. They have to follow it because that's the law. So it's not you make the determination. It is, I've just told you that I have a disability. I don't have to tell you what that disability is. You have to follow that as the law and give me the accommodations that are associated with that law.
Right. So, like Commissioner Hicks is exactly right. Like a poll worker cannot, like if you say I need this to a poll worker because I am disabled, they can't be like, explain it to me, right? And I think that there is a temptation to do that, especially if the person doesn't look physically disabled. And so you should know that they're not allowed to ask and you don't have to tell them. And so in the same way that poll workers just don't ask like any additional details, that's how I treat my sources, right? If I'm speaking to a person with a disability, they tell me what they need to tell me so that I understand the situation that they're struggling with. And that's how I put it down on the piece of paper using the words that they articulated to me. Because, there are times in my life where I have needed accommodations because like I broke my leg, right? And these are, and I don't want to come and be like, oh yeah, I'm a terrible skier every time I need you to find a ramp for me, right? And so I think these are all things that we can sympathize with and empathize with. And so, I think that as long as we're willing to trust that the person is telling us exactly what they need, and we should be able to do that, then we can articulate very clearly in our journalism what their needs are.
Something, Hannah, you mentioned about community, that whenever I do trainings on disability reporting, similar to, I guess, the toolkit that you have, like, I like to provide sort of some context for what it means to be disabled. It's an identity just like race, gender, religion. I think we're moving away from this idea that it's something inherently negative. And it's something that encompasses a rich culture and history and community. So I think when you mentioned that, that's what made me think of that. So yeah. We've got more questions coming in.
Wendy, do you mind if I grab one of these? There's a question that asks that says some journalists may avoid writing about disability issues because they're afraid of messing up. How can we get over that fear? That is the exact reason why I created the Disability Matters Toolkit. I hate to say it, but you got to get over it. You have to. Like Wendy said, it is an inherent part of a person. You wouldn't avoid writing about someone's gender or someone of a different race than you. You shouldn't be afraid to write about people with disabilities. You should be humble, I think, and probably forthcoming of saying, like, I would like to know more about this. Here's my understanding of what this means. Does this feel accurate to you? And make it a conversation. But also don't write about disabled people only in a medical context. Like Wendy said, like, we are interested in art and music and politics and business. And you should look for sources on people in the disabled community along any beat. That's sort of it, full stop.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that I experienced a similar level of discomfort when I started writing about voters with disabilities. Like, I really did, and I understand the discomfort because you feel awkward talking to somebody about something that society has labeled as negative, right? You don't want to ask them about it. You're afraid they're going to offend them, but you're not, right? Like, this is an inherent part of their being, and these people are probably willing to talk to you about it in pretty simple terms because they have to do it all the time. And so Hannah's right. We just have to get over it, and we have to embrace this as part of, like, the really diverse community that we all live in and cover.
Someone asked, Sanika asked, does voting with disabilities pose greater challenges for people of color?
I would think that yes. From what I've heard from the African American conference that I go to, the African American with Disabilities Conference, that there are additional challenges. Can't speak to what those would really be, but I'm sure that that there are additional challenges that folks face. And I think of it as the how do we lower these barriers and ensure that people can really achieve their rights of voting. And I'm sorry, I was just distracted from reading one of the questions that I wanted to answer, but yes, I believe that is the case. And unless someone else wanted to jump in on that, I would go to that question that I wanted to answer.
Go for it.
Oh, well, it was could you discuss, from Paul, can you discuss the option of election staff taking a ballot marking or ballot box to people's homes, including jails, nursing homes, and private homes, as Oregon does? And I would say that this is one of those things that grew in the pandemic as well, where people weren't able to make it to a polling place because of having COVID-19. And so election officials and bipartisan groups went to people's homes and allowed for them to cast their votes with ballot boxes or machines and so forth. One of the things that I would say that would be great is if we could continually do that, but you have to have additional resources in terms of poll workers to do that. If you only have 2 people in a polling place, you cannot go out and do those sorts of things. But I think of it as, if we can expand upon that, I think it's great because it gets more people involved, and it gets rid of that stigma of, well, you know, it's 2 Democrats who went out, or it was 2 Republicans who went out, and therefore they're stuffing the ballot box. But if you get bipartisan teams to go out and do this, then I think that's great. Any chance to expand the right to vote for people, I would be in favor of.
Sanika also asks, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, but if there is no data available on people with disabilities and voting, how do you measure success, policies, or laws? And I think that was sort of a continuation from question from Steve about what data exists on this, and there's not really a great way to measure that exactly. It's what Jessica mentioned. So
Yeah, I mean, this is a sticky issue because a lot of people are not comfortable with their disability status being public, which makes it difficult for the voter roll to fully capture who is disabled and how they are turning out, which is generally how we do that, right? And so because those flags don't exist for anonymity reasons, it is really difficult to understand how successful these machines are and how successful changes are and in serving the disabled community. And so I think that all we can really do is listen to the people in our communities, because every county has different voting machines. And so it's very difficult to do, for example, a national survey about the accessibility of a specific type of voting system, because they're different in every county. And so it's really not a data question, unfortunately, because it can't be. It's an engagement and listening question, right? And so if your county officials are engaged with this community, because there is a community in every county that is affected by this, and you just have to find them, and it takes a little bit of creativity, but you do have to proactively engage in a way that I think people just assume we can data our way around, but not this one.
Maybe one more quick question. Someone says, there is discussion in my city to allow voting by mobile phone. Can you please discuss any potential security issues with this?
They are replete. Quite a bad idea. Thomas, do you want to
Well, I
talk?
was going to say that I think that we're not right there with mobile voting. There are some states that allow for the electronic return of ballots, and I think that they go through the protocols that they need to, because the states run their election. The states run the elections, but I think that on a large scale, we are not in a where we can vote mobilely because of security issues overall. And I would want to go back to the answering of the data question. I think of it as the EAC gets more resources, then we should be able to do more research on these numbers. And so with the opening of doing the Rutgers report, which took 10 years, we didn't do one for 10 years, that hopefully we can continually do this to find out what other aspects are there out there. By particularly going towards folks who have disabilities and asking them these questions, so we can get more accurate data on these issues.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Beth to wrap things up for us, but thank you.
We want to say thank you so very much to each of our panelists today, Wendy, Hannah, Jessica, Chairman Hicks. This has been an hour full of great discussion and foundation setting for those of us joining, as well as advice to move voter accessibility issues forward in the discussion and in our coverage. And we just want to say how much we appreciate you and your expertise. We want to thank all of our participants for being here and for the great questions and discussion in the chat. We're going to send a follow-up email with the video recording, as well as a tip sheet from the program. Stay well, everyone, and we hope to see you very soon, especially at the polls. Have a great day.
Thank you. And
Thank
sign
you.
up as a poll worker. Sign up as a poll worker.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye now.